So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mediterranean Spain with myself, Lauren. I work at WSET School in London. Been teaching online now for quite some time. I teach Spain at the diploma level. That's our level 4 qualification that we do in wines, but also teach it at other levels as well. I do have a big passion for Spain. One of the reasons for that was a level 3 scholarship that I got through doing my my WSET level 3, and I won a trip across northern Spain. So I will be actually using some photos that I took on that trip as part of this presentation. And yeah, it really ignited a passion for me about Spain. So I'm very pleased to be sharing that with you this evening. Now, I've cheated a bit. I did hoped to have a glass of Mediterranean Spanish wine with me, but I didn't have any. So I have actually something from Spain too, but it isn't Mediterranean, it's a bit further in, but this is from Priorat, and it's a Verdejo, which is also very lovely. But unfortunately, I won't be going into detail about that wine and where it's made, etc. So let's see what I mean by Mediterranean Spain. Okay, so I'm going to have a little overview, just a little bit of background, put it into context. Winemaking, the grapes, just a kind of overview, but then look at specifically at some regions, and we'll be able to really focus in on what makes them different, what makes them unique, and why we should be seeking out these wines from these particular parts of the world. So, got a map of Spain here. Not every single denominación de origen is on here, but I will be zoning in and looking at some specific ones. But if you've ever done a Spanish lecture with me, I do talk about the topography, the fact that it is such an incredible country with regards to diversity, and actually its own unique styles of wines and grape varieties that they grow. So it is the second most mountainous country in Europe after Switzerland, and a lot of that is the Meseta in the centre here, so going from Madrid and all the way further north, we've got the foothills of the Pyrenees. That will be quite important when I'm talking about Mediterranean Spain in just a bit. So you can see a lot of it's very, very mountainous. There are loads and loads and loads of different grape varieties grown there, and we'll notice actually that you generally see more in the kind of northeast that are international grape varieties, and then as we go further south and further inland, you'll see that we'll have more native grape varieties. But there's a little chart here, so the top 6 grape varieties, and actually it's quite surprising because the most planted grape variety, so with over 20%, is Orden, and Orden is a white grape variety, and we're not going to talk about Orden very much because it's mostly grown in La Mancha, which I'm not classing as Mediterranean, but it is actually used a lot for distillation and for brandies de Jerez, for example. So it's grown a lot, but it's not really a wine you'll see outside of Spain very much. They do make some sort of more table wines with it, but it's not the most exciting grape variety. Tempranillo, on the other hand, lots and lots of Tempranillo. It's got many, many different synonyms. I'll talk about a couple of those synonyms when we go to the particular places. And it makes a whole range of styles of wine. So we should be if you're into Spanish wine, you should have heard of Tempranillo. It is like the main grape variety in places like Rioja, Ribera del Duero, Oro, etc. But we are actually going to parts of Spain where it's not the main grape variety, but it is still grown in many, many parts. Bobal. Now, you may not have heard of Bobal, but look, it's the 3rd most planted grape variety, and we would definitely be visiting regions where that is grown, and we'll be thinking about how that is made into some really quality wines now. It used to be more sort of mass-produced, more table wines, but there's some really exciting expressions coming out at the moment. Garnacha, you might have thought Garnacha might be further up the list there, but that is the 4th most planted grape variety, 3rd most planted black grape variety, and we'll definitely be going to some very important regions for Garnacha. Macabao, all over, so this is our white grape variety, it's all over Spain, and we'll see how it's treated differently in the different kinds of styles of wines that it makes. Then Monastrell as well. So those are our 6 top grapes, but I will be showing you lots and lots of different grape varieties. But I probably won't talk about many of them in too much detail because some of them are very, very small plantings. Right. So I'm just going to mute. There we go. Right, so styles of wine. Well, if you have, again, if you've had any lectures with me, you'll know that I'm a big fan of sparkling wine. So we will be discussing the sparkling wines coming out of Spain, and particularly Mediterranean Spain. So there's a few labelling terms to get your heads round, which I will introduce you to if you don't know them already, or maybe if you're a diploma student, a bit of recap there for you. So we've got sparkling wine, lots and lots and lots of sparkling wine. We've got white wines, we've got rosés, we've got reds, we've got big alcoholic reds, we've got lighter reds, we've got aromatic whites, we've got oak whites, we've got fortified wines as well. So if you've ever had sort of muscat from the Iberian Peninsula, you'll know that it's a very popular grape variety made in a sweeter style and fortified as well. So we'll be looking at where we can find those. And these are all, I'm talking about all in the Mediterranean side. So what am I talking about when I say Mediterranean Spain? Well, let's have a look. So I figured that it kind of has to have more of a Mediterranean climate to be Mediterranean Spain, and generally along the Mediterranean. So I'm going to be focusing on Catalonia, very much focusing on Catalonia. And of course, you can't talk about Catalonia without talking about Cava. So I'll be explaining about the Cava that comes from Catalonia in particular. I am going to include Somontano because Somontano, I think, has got enough Mediterranean influence to be classed as Mediterranean. And I think it's a really interesting denominación de origen in Spain as well. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I will be going into quite a bit of detail in Catalonia. There's lots and lots of DOs and a DOQ, so I will explain a little bit about those. And then we're going to come down south here, and I'm going to talk about the Valencia and the Murcia wider areas. So you can see, including Uchel, Requena, Alicante, Yecla, Jumilla. And then I thought, well, why not? You know, if you're going to go on holiday in Spain and you want to go to the Mediterranean, you may well go to the Balearic Islands. So Mallorca as well. I'll have a little talk about what you can expect to find there. So yeah, we're just basically doing a little trip all the way around here. Now, I do class Jerez as a Mediterranean climate, even though it is on the Atlantic, but I've done a session on that. So if you want to know about sherry wines from Jerez, then you can watch a video that I've done previously. Okay, so I'm going to start with Cava because I always think it's nice to start with a sparkling wine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the reputation behind Cava, the future of Cava, and it's always, I think, I think Cava is a really interesting topic to debate because there's quite a lot to talk about with it. It's suffered, its reputation has suffered, but there's lots of things happening at the moment which I think will bring it back up, but it's going to be interesting to see what actually happens. Now, I can see the title here is Traditional Method Sparkling Wines, because Cava isn't the only traditional method sparkling wine that I'm going to talk about. And I'm just going to do a quick recap of what traditional method means. So traditional method is when you do a second fermentation to make a sparkling wine in the bottle. Okay, so you make your base wine, so like a dry wine, that will go into a nice thick bottle. You will add yeast and sugar to start a second fermentation, so that will be sealed. If you have a look here, you can see that we've got these crown caps on these bottles, so that'll be sealed. And then a second fermentation will take place. It usually takes place over a few weeks. After that second fermentation, you've got the dead yeast cells in the bottle, and given enough time, they will give off characteristics of pastry, bread, dough, these yeasty notes, and that's what we call autolysis, because it's the breaking down of the dead yeast cells in the bottle. Now, you need quite a lot of time for that to happen, okay? And after that, then you have to go through this process of riddling and disgorgement, which is basically getting the dead yeast cells into the neck of the bottle and then out of the bottle. And then you will probably add some sugar right at the end to make the wine nice and balanced. Now, that's the traditional method. So it's quite a complex method. It's the most labor-intensive method, but it's the way they make Cava. And it's the way they pretty much make all of the sparkling wines in this part of the world. Now, I'm being very specific about where we are in this part of the world. And Sant Sadurní d'Anoia is one of the most important towns in Penedes, where many of the wineries are. So 95% of what you get Cava-wise is from Penedes, which is within the larger Denominación de Origen, or DO as I refer to them, of Catalunya. So pretty much very, very vast majority of your Cava comes from Catalunya, more specifically Penedes, more specifically Sant Sadurní d'Anoia. Okay, now Cava, there's two big producers. You've probably heard of them, Cordonnier, Fresnay. Okay, they make millions and millions and millions of bottles of wine. The quality level can range from very easy drinking, quite simple, okay, so not very expensive, all the way up to quite expensive, complex wines. And the reason they can become more complex, well, the fruit, you want really good fruit to make the better wines, but also the amount of time after the fermentation when the bottle is in contact with those dead yeast cells. Now, the thing about Cava is there's a minimum aging requirement on the leaves, which is 9 months. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So, I'm just going to look at some of the grape varieties that they grow to make Cava, because it's local grape varieties are generally most of what is being used. So Macabau is also known as Priorat if you're in Rioja. That's 36%. They tend to grow that at slightly lower altitudes, and I'll talk a little bit more about Penedes and where they grow certain grapes in just a bit. So Macabau, 36%, generally grown a little bit lower down. It has kind of apple and citrus notes. Okay, Charolais, which tends to be grown a little bit higher. That can have quite floral notes, but also can give an earthiness to the wines. If it doesn't ripen quite well enough, it can give almost a slightly rubbery note. So you might find that in the less expensive Cavas. Priorat is grown quite high up, and that's pretty floral, okay, and it's got some finesse and tends to have good acidity, particularly when grown quite high up. Because we are in quite a warm part of Spain, you do generally need to harvest these grapes a little bit earlier to retain that acidity, but it isn't uncommon to acidify later down the line. So that's your main grape varieties, particularly in Penedes, okay, but they are permitted to use Chardonnay. So you can get Chardonnay, 100% Chardonnay Cavas is absolutely possible. They are also permitted to use Garnacha Tinta and Pinot Noir, and they make white wines as well with those, like they do in Champagne. They use black grapes to make white wines. And Trepat they use to make rosé Cava, I thought we might call Rosado. Now, the difference is, well, I'll talk about this on the next slide, but just to point out the pictures here. So we've got some bottles here that it's just the end of the traditional method process. So they're getting ready to have the lids taken off and the and basically the cells to come out and go out to market, really. And then here, so this is, you can see they've got Charolais vineyards. You can see that written on the sign there. This is from a producer called Villanau. You can actually buy a lot of their wines in many merchant supermarkets included, and this is the wine, quite a modern setup there. So very, very lovely Cavas they produce. So I'm just going to now go through some of the, please excuse my photo there, I couldn't help myself when I was wandering around the winery. So we've got some labelling terms here. So Cava, so your basic Cava, that is 9 months minimum requirement, and so usually is about 9 months. Okay, now 9 months aging on the lees, so before you riddle and you disgorge, at 9 months is not going to give you autolytic character. You're not going to get lots and lots of bready, biscuity notes. You're probably going to get more of a fruity, quite a light intensity, fruity style of wine. Okay, not going to be very expensive. That's your basic Cava. Interestingly, with Cava, you can have vintage and you have non-vintage, but most of it tends to be vintage, even though it's not stated on the label. Because unlike in places like Champagne, where they have vintage variation, so the years are quite different, and you can get years that are really good and years where you don't get such healthy grapes. You don't really get that problem so much in this part of Spain. So they tend to really use the grapes harvested, and also it costs a lot of money to keep wine in the cellars and those reserve wines for a long time, and there's no real need to do that so much. So that's your Cava. Now Cava Reserva, okay, is 15 months minimum aging. So you can see we're now should start to get a bit of that autolytic character, a bit light autolysis there, so a little bit of that yeastiness. And then Gran Reserva is 30 months minimum aging, so we're definitely going to start seeing more of that kind of bready, biscuity notes, the kind of things we might expect more from Champagne, but they're not allowed to add a lot of sugar. So these aren't allowed to be sweet styles of Cava, and the Gran Reserva must always be the drier style. So I'm having a look now at the labelling terms you would expect. So brut typically with Cava would be around 7 or 8 grams per litre of sugar, and that's what they add at the end. Okay, so it's not very much, and it's just there to kind of give a bit of balance, enhance some of the fruity characteristics coming through, but it should be perceived as dry on the palate. Semi-Secco, now we are talking about adding quite a considerable amount of sugar to make a sweet style, but it's not overly popular in Semi-Secco. More sort of Germany, they like that style. And Brut Nature is no sugar added whatsoever. So there's more of that coming out at the moment, because to be honest, these wines aren't as acidic as your Champagne wines or your English sparkling wines. They don't really need to add that much sugar in the first place. So Brut Nature, I think, will probably be a growing category with Cava. Now, because Cava has got or has had a bit of a sullied reputation, because you do get these very inexpensive ones, particularly in this country. I don't know what it's like where you are, because I know you're based all over the place, but in the UK we have a thing where you'll go into a supermarket and you'll see Cava for like £4 a bottle. Sometimes it's on offer for even less than that. I can't believe how cheap that is. I mean, if we think about £4, it's probably the equivalent of around €5. Okay, so it's really not expensive. And then and I think what they do a lot is what we call a loss leader. So they try and get people to come into the shop, buy this Cava because it's so cheap, and then hopefully they'll buy some other stuff as well. So that just doesn't help with the reputation for Cava at all, because you just think, oh, because it's when things are too cheap, we'll question it, don't we? And it loses its value as well. You just think, well, it must be really not very good. It must be a very easy way to make it, and we know it's the traditional method. So, you know, it's a bit worrying. So it has really suffered there. And then when things are priced too cheaply, who wants to spend more on them? Not necessarily said, well, you know, it was too cheap, I'm happy to spend another £4 on it, and that's not going to happen. So when you start selling things cheaply, it's very difficult to get the prices back where they should be. So having these other categories should help with that. You can see that you're going to have much better fruit in order to withstand further aging. So I've missed out Rosado here. So Rosado basically means rosé. Rosé rules for Cava are much stricter than in Champagne. In Champagne, you can blend white wine and red wine together to make a rosé. Absolutely not. To make a rosé in Cava, then you have to have skin contact. Okay, so you have to get that colour coming from the skin of the red grape. You can't just blend red and white wine together. So another labelling term, which is quite recent, so 2017, is Cava de Paraje. And Cava de Paraje basically means from a specific place. Okay, so we're talking about a paraje is an estate or a lieu dit, or like a named place, and it has to be made there, bottled there, and you can see that the aging requirement there is even higher than your Gran Reserva. So they're really saying, look, we're going to have premium, really top quality stuff out there and make it clear what it is. So 10-year-old vines as well, so they have to be really quite old vines, getting right down the roots down there to get the water and be a bit more concentrated, so there's generally lower yields, and you're not allowed to acidify. So with your general Cava, you'd acidify, but with these, no acidification. So they must be picked at a time when you're going to get really good acidity in the first place. These also can't be sweet either. So that's your Cava de Priorat. Now this was produced, this labelling term, as a response to dissatisfaction of a lot of Cava producers. However, it wasn't enough. So we will see that there's a couple of other labelling terms for traditional method sparkling wines. So one is classic Penedes, so coming away from the wider area of Cava, actually being specific, classic Penedes, and that has to be organic and 15 months minimum aging. I have to say, I haven't had one of these wines. I'm going to look out for them, but there's not that many of them out there. And this was kind of in response to Raventos, who broke away from Cava, and they refused to call themselves Cava. In fact, they wanted to create a denominación de origen from Catalonia d'Anoia, but it's a bit of a mouthful. So, and that hasn't really happened. But what has happened is a group, it's around 10 producers, and even those small producers, they're smaller on the higher, bigger scale of small. And they came together and they created their own term, and you can see it on this label here, Corpinat, and that means the heart of Penedes. And they gave their own rules and regulations around how their wine should be. So if you pick up a bottle of Gramonas, this is one particularly notable producer, Recipient is another one, the same bottle of wine before 2019, I think, in fact, no, probably before about 2018, would have Cava written on it because they were under that denominación de origen. But now, no, it's got Corpinat. There's no mention of Cava on that bottle anywhere. Okay, so it's a completely different category. But these have always been top producers with loads of integrity. Not saying others don't, but they often have been using grapes that are from particularly great sites, doing lots of manual stuff as well, very manual, hand harvesting, because actually with Cava it's not a requirement to hand harvest. Most of it is hand harvested, but I'm seeing more and more where they're using machines. But some of the stipulations for this style of wine is 90% of the local grape varieties, so those grape varieties, Macabau, Charolais, Priorat that I mentioned before. They've got different minimum aging requirements. It's a bit of a headache, isn't it, really? 15 months here, 9 months there, but they go up to 60 months. So within their portfolio, they will have different levels of Cavas. Again, has to be organic, and like I said, these are hand harvested. Now, I think these, you know, Cava, you pick and choose. You know, if you're in Spain, if you're lucky enough to be in that part of Spain, and you can go to some merchants, even some really nice supermarkets, you can get some really top quality stuff for not very much money. And this is another reason why I'm really enjoying talking about Mediterranean Spain, is because the value for money in Spain is fantastic. Okay, it is so, you get world-class wines in Spain, and I will show you some of the regions where we can really see some of these, and compared to what you'd pay equivalent in France or in Italy, it's just so much cheaper. And the same thing with the top quality Cavas. So this, I think this Cava here, actually, I think that costs around 15 euros in Spain. So, you know, that's not bad at all. And you can see it's 2014, and it's hand harvested, organic, you know, everything quite manual, and they're brilliant wines, absolutely brilliant, really. And they got that, and that's had quite a bit of time on the lees. I'm pretty sure it's probably around 4 years or something. So that's got really nice autolytic character. So yeah, and they have a sense of place as well. You do pick up those kind of slightly, particularly with like Charolais, kind of fennel, herby notes. You get the citrus from the Macabau. You've got the floral from the Priorat. Maybe there'll be a Chardonnay in there as well to give it again some sort of structural elements. Anyway, great wine. So that's Cava. That's my Cava rant over. And just, you know, be very, very aware that not all Cavas are equal. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about Catalunya. Now, Catalunya is really rather large. I'm not sure if the people of Catalunya would be upset I'm calling this Mediterranean Spain when kind of Catalunya is vying for independence. But I am going to talk quite a lot about Catalunya because I think it's an incredibly, incredibly important wine region. And I haven't listed every single GO, or in fact, it's actually a capital O, apologies. But I'm going to talk about the ones that I think are probably the most important, and some of the stunning wines that you can get from them. And you'll see that they're on this map here. So Costa del Sol is not contiguous at all. It's got 3 sort of separate parts. I'm going to talk about one in particular. It's a fascinating region. Then Penedes, as I mentioned before, because Penedes is really the home of Cava. Okay, and you can see that some of it's by the coast and some of it's in the foothills of the Pyrenees, which is really important, and I'll meant to talk about that. Monsanto, so that's this kind of funny little ring there. And then inside of Monsanto, we've got Priorat. So I'll be talking about those 4 regions in particular. There are others, so in Porter, which is actually right here, it's on the border of France, okay, I'll talk about that a little bit. We've got Lleida, Pla de Barge, Alea, Concha de Barbera, Tarragona, Terra Alta. But to be honest with you, a lot of what's produced in these areas is for Cava as well. So they do make some lovely wines, but I want to talk about these other regions, those other 4 regions more, because I think they've got a little bit more interest there, but all very good value. I mean, you can get lovely wines from all of these regions, but let's go into that in a moment. So Costa del Sol. Now Costa del Sol is a really interesting BO, because it is basically the majority of it, well, just under the majority of it, is owned by Catalonia. So the Reventos, Manuel Reventos, is the founder of Catalonia, and they basically founded this site, and their winery is Romat. And Romat are a really exciting, interesting winery, and they have got some elevation, as you can see, so 200 to 700 meters. And we are kind of further inland as well. So we've got those kind of slight foothills of the Pyrenees there. Now, because it doesn't retain water when it rains there, it is quite a tricky place to grow grapes. And when they first kind of, I think it was the beginning of the 20th century when they kind of started thinking about growing grapes here, but it was really difficult. And in fact, they completely changed the landscape and sort of dug lakes. So there's man-made lakes which are there for the irrigation. So you'll see that they are watering their plants a lot. Another note, just to talk about irrigation in Spain, it's not been that long since they are actually allowed to irrigate. So, and it really depends on the regulatory body. So every DO in Spain has what you call a Consejo Regulador, and they determine what you can and cannot do. So the grape varieties you can grow, whether you can irrigate or not. Now, generally you can irrigate, but there is usually some stipulations. So when during the growing season you can irrigate. You can only irrigate if the weather conditions mean that you have to, that kind of thing. But before it was a firm no, and now there is some movement there. So Reventos was established in Romat was established in 1978, and they've been making some fantastic wines ever since. And they're very easily available in that part of Spain, not so easily available in the UK so much. And they make wines from your very sort of basic, easy drinking sort of red blends. So let's say, for example, Cabernet Sauvignon, Tempranillo, and sort of lighter bodied Chardonnays, because there's quite a lot of international grape varieties that are grown here, and all the way to some really top sort of oaked styles of wine. And what I really like about this producer, this company, is that they are very innovative and they are always trying new things. So they were kind of growing these international grape varieties, which you do see more in Catalonia because of the proximity to France. But they were also looking at when to actually grow grape varieties and when to harvest them. So this was in October. I was in October. Now, these are grapes that are close to being ripe, okay? But they hadn't been harvested yet, because what they were doing there, so this is really fascinating. If you're doing the kind of high level studying, or you're a bit wine geeky, you'll probably understand that there's a usual growing period for grapes. Okay, so in the northern hemisphere, we have the springtime, so coming up sort of April, March, April, and then you get your shoots growing, and then towards the summertime you get the ripening of the grapes, and then you're harvesting at the end of summer, beginning of the autumn. But what they decided here was they wanted to completely change the growing season for this grape variety, because they thought that actually the growing season wasn't quite right for this grape variety, Cabernet Sauvignon. So they decided that they were going to sort of prompt it to start ripening later. And then extend the ripening period to pick it much later. Anyway, it was all quite revolutionary stuff, really. So I think it's fascinating to think that they've gone there, you know, quite a long time ago, dug out lakes to make sure they can irrigate. Then they're thinking about how they can actually change the cycle of the vine to produce wine. So, you know, maybe you think, oh, well, come on, that's a bit too much interference. But I think it's quite fascinating. So the grape varieties they're growing, so they are growing the Macabeo, the Priorat, the Charolais. We would expect that in many parts of Catalunya. Chardonnay is embraced. Yep, I think Chardonnay from Catalunya can be absolutely fantastic. I've had some really, really stunning examples. Garnacha Blanca. Okay, so Garnacha Blanca also grown in Rioja, grown in France. It would be called it's Grenache Blanc. And we've also got it being grown in this part of the world as well, and that gives you Garnacha Blanca gives you kind of sort of peachy, melony characteristics. The acidity is around medium, but it gives some nice thickness to the wine. And then Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc as well, actually being very much appreciated and grown in Rioja as well as in Rueda. So, you know, it's not just here. And then our black grape varieties, Garnacha, Tempranillo, Cabernet Sauvignon, you can see we've got some Cabernet Sauvignon there, and Merlot too. And often they blend these grape varieties. Not to say they won't do single varietal wines, but there is blending going on. So that was our Costa del Sol. So look out for them. They're not expensive wines generally, but I think very well made, but not expensive. Now, Penedes. So if we go back to that map quickly, I will take us there just briefly. We have got this region here, and we've got the Mediterranean coast. We're bang on the Mediterranean coast here. Now, when you're close to the sea, you are quite low down, so bear that in mind. Then as you come away from the sea, you're starting to climb up until you're getting into the foothills of the Pyrenees there. So we are going to have quite a diversity of climates. And as you go higher up, it gets cooler. So we can actually split it into three. Penedes Maritime, which is by the sea. Penedes Central, which is up to around 500 meters. And then above that, we're Penedes Superior. And so our grape varieties for Cava are grown at different heights. I mentioned that before. Macabeo tending to be lower, then the Charolais followed up high with the Priorat. But what they also do is they make wines, they grow the grapes that need cooler climates higher up. And because of that, you've got this real diversity of grape varieties being grown. So at the bottom, you are going to grow your black grape varieties mostly because it's warmer there. So more of the Monastrell. They do grow quite a bit of Monastrell down there. Your Cabernet Sauvignon, your Merlot, maybe some Tempranillo. As you go higher up, Tempranillo again, because it has like a more moderate climate. Pinot Noir, and we're looking at, you know, again those Cava varieties, Chardonnay, and then as we go really high, so up to that kind of 800 meters, we're looking at Gewürztraminer and Riesling. So Penedes, amazing. If you think about it, and there was a question asked on the Master of Wine paper a while ago, and they said, can you grow Cabernet Sauvignon and Riesling in the same region? Well, yes, if you're a Penedes. So your Riesling at the top, your Cabernet Sauvignon at the bottom. So, I mean, it's an incredible diversity. And I just want to talk a little bit about why we might have this diversity and why we've got some really exciting winemaking happening in Penedes, because one of the pioneers and actually changed the face of Spanish winemaking, basically from the 1970s, was Miguel Torres. So Miguel Torres is from Penedes. He learned about wine in Dijon, came back and started using things like stainless steel, introducing different grape varieties, and just really modernizing the Spain, and because Spain has had a bit of a checkered past with wine. You know, if we go back to there was a civil war, there was a Second World War, you know, there was economic issues under Franco. There's been a lot of problems, and then a lot of wine was being made, but not particularly fantastic wine. I mean, Spain makes a lot of wine, about third biggest winemaking country. It definitely has been. And it's got loads and loads and loads of land under vine, the most of any country, but partly because a lot of the vines are grown at a distance from each other. I'll show you some photos in just a bit. But yeah, so it's had a bit of a checkered past, but you get this one man coming back and just saying, look at what we can do. And really that has changed the way we see wine in Spain. Even though it's got a very, very old history and lots of tradition, particularly if you think about places like Jerez, even though we have that, actually what we're seeing now is quite modern, really. It's not like in France, where you've got these regions like Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Rhone, and they've been doing things the same for so long. It's not really like that in Spain. So that's why one of the reasons I find it very, very exciting. So yeah, Penedes, I think, a fantastic region, a fantastic video for just showing you what can happen. But of course, we are in the north and we do have altitude. So this isn't going to be something you can do all over Spain. Right. So now we're going to move a bit further down, a bit further south in and over a little bit to the east in Catalonia, and I'm going to talk about Monsanto. And the next one, okay. So Monsanto. Now Monsanto is right next to Priorat, and I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail with Priorat in just a moment. Monsanto kind of circles Priorat. It does get some Mediterranean influence from it. It's not quite as warm as some parts of Priorat. Parts of it are quite a bit further away from the Mediterranean. But it's, I think, a very overlooked in Catalunya because it produces some fantastic wines and not absolutely high prices. And if you like the wines of Priorat, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, then I think you will like the wines of Monsanto because they're not that similar. When you can get high up, so above 300 meters or so, then we do start to see more acidity in the wines, and wines that are a bit better for longer aging. The soil types are really varied. They've got clay, they've got sand, they've got this yicorea, which I'm going to talk about a bit in the next slide, which is a shiny sort of mica-based soil type. And where they've got parcels of that, and where they've got a bit more altitude, they are making some fantastic wines, and their grape varieties are very similar to what we're going to see in the next slide as well. So they've got the Garnacha being sort of reigning here, Carignana, I'll talk about in a moment, Tempranillo, Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, and Merlot, and then they do make some white, but it's predominantly red. So you can see a very beautiful part of the world there, Monsanto. So I'm going to talk really more about Priorat because Monsanto is a bit like, I kind of see Monsanto as sort of the younger sibling, if you like, of Priorat. So Priorat, here we go, Priorato. It's a DOQ. So I've been talking about Denominación d'Origen. So you might have heard of a Denominación d'Origen Calificada. So that would be a DOCA. So Rioja is a DOCA, and Priorat is what we might call a DOCA, but we are in Catalunya, so we call it a DOQ because we've got a different language. So same word really, but beginning with Q. Now, it became a DOQ in 2009. It was an area that was abandoned, particularly during the Civil War, and then in Catalunya there was a big textile business, and it just made more sense for people to move into that rather than sort of slave over these very, very steep slopes and rocky terrains. It was not really the nicest or easiest thing to do to be winemaker in Priorat. So it's kind of abandoned, and then was sort of rediscovered in, I think, 1989 by a group of winemakers, and it was kind of a little gang. So one of them was René Barbier, who was one of the pioneers. In fact, he has relatives in London, not far from me, who sell his wines. So that's nice. I've met the cousins. So René Barbier, there's Alvaro Palacios. You may have heard of him. So these are two particularly well-known winemakers making some absolutely stunning wines in Priorat. There's Christopher Cannon as well, an English gentleman, and in fact this is his cellar, one of his cellars there. Clos de Figueres, beautiful wines. So there's a group, they kind of pioneered, started it, and then, you know, it was clear that there was some fabulous wine to be made. But this fabulous wine, it wasn't easy because, like I've mentioned before, we've got this quite difficult terrain. It's very steep in places. I don't think I'm showing you the steepest bits. They've got these terraces, sort of stone terraces. You use donkeys to try and get around there. And also the vines are really, really old. Okay, so like they encourage these very old wines, like 75-year-old vines. And how much fruit are you going to get off a 75-year-old vine? So the yields are ridiculous. I think the minimum requirement is quite low anyway, so like 39 hectolitres a hectare, but we're looking more at like 5 to 6 hectolitres a hectare. That's like, you know, barely a bottle of wine. So very, very, very small yield. Again, I've talked about the Yicorella soil, so they love their Yicorella soil. It has got this kind of a quartzy, shiny, you know, glimmers, shimmers, all that kind of stuff. But they do have quite a bit of altitude, going up to 750 meters. So taking you fairly high, quite a lot of it is quite high. It's very hilly, and you get these mists as well. So you get these kind of mists coming in from the Mediterranean, which really help to cool down over sort of early morning and keep the acidity. So what you get from these wines is just an incredible concentration and acidity, which gives you a style of wine unlike pretty any other you're going to get when it comes to Garnacha. So I'm going to talk about the style of wine in just a moment, because it's a particular style of wine which I think is really, really wonderful. Now I've just got here the rainfall. Now you're going to be interesting to see, as we go further south, we're going to notice that the rainfall becomes less and less and less. So 500 to 600 millimeters average rainfall. Yeah, that's okay. That's good. You know, we probably don't need to irrigate too much, but we'll see how it goes down as we go further south. So Garnacha Tinta being the main grape variety, followed by Carignana. So Carignana you might know as Carignan. So that is also grown in France. So generally in the south of France, Carignan and Garnacha, or Carignana and Garnacha, need quite hot climates. So it does work quite well here, this proximity to the Mediterranean. They do grow some, they have incorporated some international grape varieties, not too much. You don't see too much of the blend. And then about 6% of what is made is white wine. And don't overlook the white wines of Priorat. They can be stunning, and Garnacha Blanca and Macabau are those wines. Now they do like their oak, as you can probably see from this photo. Okay, so quite a bit of new oak is being used. I think that didn't used to be so much the case, but it can take it. And what you get are very concentrated, high tannin, high acidity, sort of baked fruit, dried fruit, wines with huge aging capacity. Really, really top one. So La Mita by Alvaro Palacios, Clos Magodor by René Barbet, just a couple to name out there. Some of the most expensive wines in Spain, in fact. Now, they have got their own kind of classification as well. So we've got Vie de Villa. Now, Vie de Villa is a labelling term which refers to the 12 subzones of Priorat. So 12 subzones, and you can put the name of that subzone on there rather than if you're blending across subzones, the name of that. Then we've got Vie de Paraje. Now we've seen that word before because that was with the Cava. So this actually is a specific place, a named site. Okay, so like in France, they call that a lieu dit, a named place. And there's quite a lot of those. There's 459. Then we get to this is kind of a Burgundian thing. And if you saw the Rioja one I did a while ago, we were talking about the future of Rioja, and they're kind of going down that road a little bit there. Then we've got Viña Classificada. Now, Viña Classificada is now sort of from a specific vineyard. And so that is kind of what we would call a cru. Okay, so kind of at cru level. And then Gran Viña Classificada is like your Grand Cru level. So we're very much getting very Burgundian with our labelling terms. And of course, these are going to become more expensive the more site specific they become. So a little bit about Priorat there. And yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place and fantastic wine. Okay, so I can see there's questions coming thick and fast, and I hope that Julia is able to help there or make a note, and I'll try and answer them at the end if possible. So I mean, I do have a bit of a bias, I think, possibly towards Catalonia, because I do go there when I can in the summer. I try to go every year, and I tend to actually stay near in the Emporda area, so I'm a bit of a fan. Again, they grow lots of different grape varieties in Emporda. You know, it's not too dissimilar to a bit further down in Penedes. And one of the bigger producers there, actually you can see, is Priorat, not to be confused with the grape variety, Priorat. And they actually make some beautiful Cava, and they make some really stunning red wines. I think this is one of their more entry-level reds, but look at that funky bottle, really lovely. Shouldn't judge a wine by its labels, but it's just cool when they're that pretty. But no, they make some very, very serious wines as well. So they do the whole shebang, you know, big Garnacha wines and Cabernet Sauvignon blends often, also Cava, and they make, and then there's some very light white wines that are made there as well, using Malvasia. So, you know, lots and lots of interesting stuff going on there, and not expensive, and lovely with the seafood. I mean, you're by the sea, you want these light whites as well. But you know, you've got gorgeous tapas as well. Let's not forget some very nice meat dishes as well. I mean, you know, the opportunities for pairing are endless. As I mentioned before, a lot of these are to do with Cava production. I've had some beautiful Cavas just from Lleida and Alea, for example. And Conca de Barbera is the grape variety that they use to make a lot of the Rosado styles. So yeah, each have got their own thing going on, but probably not quite as exciting as the regions I've already shown you. Right, so I did say that I wanted to talk about Somontano. So this is not in Catalonia, this is neighbouring Aragon, but in Aragon there are some other TOs. So we've got Campo de Borja, Cariñena and Calafate. Cariñena, very confusing, because of course we've seen that Cariñena is the name of a grape variety, and weirdly in Cariñena they don't really plant much Cariñena, but that's by the by. I'm not talking about those regions, I'm talking about Somontano. And Somontano, as you can see, is actually pretty close to Catalunya, therefore a bit more Mediterranean. And I just feel like Somontano deserves a bit of attention because it's overlooked, and it makes some lovely wines, lovely clean, pure wines from, again, a range of different grape varieties, including quite a few of these international grape varieties. But also, can we see, we have Alcanon, Moristel and Paraletta, which are all native grape varieties and native to Somontano, and were nearly became extinct, particularly after all those troubling times with civil war and world wars, etc. So they have got specific grape varieties just for those regions, but they are very small production. But what I would say is one of the things they do very, very well are the international grape varieties. So they've got both sides of the coin there, but the international grape varieties, they do incredibly well. Like I said before, in Penedes as well, they do them really, really well. The problem is you are in competition with the rest of the world when you start growing Chardonnay and Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc and Gewürztraminer. Although their Gewürztraminer does win quite a lot of medals. It's very, very varietally defined, really, really lovely. But when you taste it, are you going to go, this is from Somontano? No, because it's not really that kind of region, and so that's something that needs to be worked on a bit, get them a little bit more of an identity. But the wines that are made are really, really lovely. They've got some fantastic producers there and a lot of growers, and they're doing some really great stuff, but it's just kind of overlooked because of just the mass competition around the world, really. So we've got 500 millimeters of rainfall, so you know, decent amounts there, and sandstone mainly soils, and some good altitude. We are in, actually Somontano actually means under the mountain, so we are really by those Pyrenees there. And so you see Pinot Noir as well. So some really nice range of wines. Some of these are blends, some of these are varietal, but yeah, one to look out for. Okay, so now I am travelling quite a bit south. So jumping down a little bit, and we're in the kind of overriding area of Valencia. So Valencia, now we can see we've got a drop in our rainfall, so 450 millimeters rainfall. So it is quite important to irrigate at this level. We've got within Valencia actually a subzone called Alto Turia. When I think of the south of Spain, in the southeast coast of Spain, I think of big alcoholic red wines. But actually, there's quite a lot of white wine produced there. And this subzone, the main grape varieties are Murciélago. It's not the most exciting grape variety, to be honest, but it does make, you know, some nice, pleasant white wines, and Macabau, which we know about because that's the grape variety that was grown for Cava production and has nice appley, citrusy notes. So that's one. But otherwise, in Valencia, we do have a lot of Monastrell, which I'm going to talk about in just a bit. So we've got Moscatel Valencia. So Moscatel is its own bio, and the Muscat, this is Muscat. Now, if you've had Muscat before, Muscat is a very, very aromatic grape variety. So it's very grapey, floral, peachy, and they make a 15% alcohol wine there, so fortified, and it's really cheap. I haven't had it before, but I'd heard that they did do this Muscatel, so I was a bit wondering what it was like. You know, is it going to be similar to the kind of muscats you get in the south of France? So if you've ever had, you know, your reef salt, muscats, that kind of thing. And I think it probably is quite similar. So it tends to be a youthful style of fortified wine, 15% alcohol, but it's so inexpensive. So I was seeing you can buy it in the supermarket here for like around £6 a bottle. But yeah, so that's something that's unique to that particular part of Spain there. And then we've got Uchel Requena. Now, Uchel Requena is something better. It has been seen to have a reputation for fairly basic Bobal wines. Now, Bobal, you saw, was the third most planted grape variety in Spain, and most of it is grown down in this part of Spain. And actually, next door, we've got another region, Manchuelo, but we're not really Mediterranean there. But Bobal, particularly old vine Bobal, is getting a lot more attention. It makes nice rosés, and you get a nice rosé, but actually it makes some very nice. It's got good acidity, it's got good tannins. It doesn't always look that dark, interestingly, but it can make some very lovely wines. So it's working out for Bobal, and it's not expensive at all. There's some really good producers doing some really good stuff there. Then we've got Alicante Dio, which is kind of dotted around. And again, we are talking Monastrell mostly, like with actually the red Valencia wine. So mostly Monastrell. Monastrell is a grape variety, Mourvedre is also known as. It's also one of the grape varieties you're allowed to use for Cava, to make white Cavas in, and the rosés. But not very much of it is used for Cava. But down here, it can make some really big wines because the alcohol levels can get pretty high. But we'll have a look at the next region for those particularly high alcohol levels. We've also got some other grape varieties, which you might think, well, we're in Alicante, we've got Alicante Boucher. Alicante Boucher is a really interesting grape variety. It is a black grape variety. The skin is black and the inside is black as well, so that the pulp is black. Well, it's got sort of reddy, colourful pulp, which you don't usually get. Next time you have a grape, which is a black grape, peel the skin and you'll see the inside. It looks green and it's got sort of transparent liquid. Not the case with Alicante Boucher. What that can do is add real colour to wines. So we call that kind of grape variety a tempura, where it means the inside has got colour. And then, of course, Garnacha and Bobal. I mean, they all, Tempranillo, actually, down here, is called Cencibel, so Cencibel. And then up in Catalunya, it's got another name. It's called Ue de Llebre, which means eye of the hare, as in like rabbit hair. So, yeah, some interesting synonyms around Spain for Tempranillo. Okay, and have a look at this. Look how widely apart these vines are. You can see these kind of sandy soils. This is very low density planting, and that's why Spain has got a lot of land under vine, but doesn't actually produce the most wine. So it's got the most land under vine, but doesn't produce the most wine because the vines are so far apart. But that's so necessary in this part of the world where it's getting more and more arid, less water, so you've got to fight for that water, and you don't want to have loads and loads of vines there all fighting together and not getting what they need, like here as well. And can you see that here we've got this kind of very limestoney, pale soil type as well. Looks a little bit like the soil you get in Jerez, Albarita soil. Now here, 300 millimeters of rainfall, so you can see why they need to plant these so far apart. I think we've got a bit of the Mesita over there, and you can get up to 18% alcohol wines with Monastrell grown in Jumilla, which is crazy. So it really is a challenge to try not to have that alcohol level in your wine, because no one wants big alcoholic soup, as my colleague Michael Priorat might say. So you want to bring those levels down and probably pick a bit earlier. So yeah, I mean, I've had some 15%. That was quite high enough, thank you very much. But that doesn't mean you get these very rich, full-bodied wines, lots of baked dried fruit character. And they can be done very, very well. So Juan Gil are the family Juan Gil. They have wineries all over Spain, and they do some fantastic Jumilla wines at different levels of oaking, with their top wine in their portfolio having spent quite a few months on oak, and that's a very nice wine. Another thing they're doing in Jumilla, and actually in the south of Spain, is growing more and more Syrah. And Syrah, usually I wouldn't expect it to grow so well in such a hot climate, but it does pretty well down here, and I'm seeing it more and more kind of labelled as Shiraz. They're giving the Australians a run for their money. That's definitely the case, because that's the kind of style you're looking at. It's not your Rhone kind of style. It's more of a New World style, very fruit forward, lots of lovely black fruit, licoricey, chocolatey notes coming through there. So Yekla, right next to Jumilla, very similar to Jumilla, but they don't sell a lot of their wine domestically. So a lot of that gets exported, 95%, quite a high amount. And that's again Monastrell. And then Gulas, which again is very, very similar, but maybe not quite as exciting as what's going on in Jumilla. Lots of fun stuff happening in Jumilla as well. They have like festivals for wine, and yeah, really nice part of the world. Definitely to go on holiday. Maybe not bang in August, but just outside those times of the year. Now, if I'm going to talk about Mediterranean Spain, I have to mention the islands, don't I? So, and this is a bit of a learning thing for me, because I've actually not been to Balearic Islands. I really want to, it just hasn't happened. And island wines are really interesting, because you see these parts of the world like Santorini, Greece, where they've got their vines made into baskets. You've got the Canary Islands, where you've got stone walls on these volcanic soils protecting the grapes as well. So, and sand dunes and all sorts of amazing stuff. All looks like they've been growing sand dunes, all sorts of amazing stuff. I'm always excited by these kind of wines. And also, of course, because they're islands, you get a lot of indigenous grape varieties. So we've got Manso Negro and Pellet, for example, which makes very nice, fragrant wines. So Pellet they're gently blended together. But again, these are native grape varieties making something a little bit different. And other native white grapes, we've got Moll, or what is also called Prensal Blanc, too. I don't know much about them, because there isn't much out there, but all I know is it's quite fragrant and light, and blended with Manso Negro. And then we've got, again, the other grape varieties that we'd expect, and two quite there's a few DOs on the Balearic Islands, but these are the two most important ones, Benissalim and Playa Levant, referring to the Levant part of Spain, and that drying wind that comes through. So that's pretty much a little whistle-stop tour from the North Mediterranean to the South Mediterranean. Of course, there are many other DOs, but just to give you an idea of the diversity and the range of wines, I hope that was interesting. I'm ready for some questions now. Just if you haven't seen this before, we've got lots of handles there. So if you want to talk about this or anything else, please feel free to use them. Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen. And I'll stop the recording as well.